a continent rewriting its story? Are we evolving or erasing ourselves? Welcome to the Pulse of Africa, where we explore the forces shaping Africa's political, cultural, and developmental trajectory.
Today, we are examining one of the most enduring debates in African thought: who defines development? From colonial legacies to neoliberal reforms and indigenous renewal, Africa's struggle is not only economic, it's existential. It's about how we modernize without losing ourselves. Starting off with our first segment, which is about defining development in accordance with competing paradigms. You know, Fraul, development has never been a neutral concept. In the 1950s and 1960s, modernization theory dominated academic and policy thinking. It posited that all societies progress through a linear sequence of stages, from traditional to modern, as industrialized Western nations being the ultimate model.
Yes. I think you are referring to Rostow and his 1960 book about the stages of economic growth and a non-communist manifesto. He proposed a linear model describing how traditional societies transform into a modern industrial economies. He suggested that all countries go through the same path, the same 5 stages, representing a structural shift in production, social value, and an economic organization. We will further delve into the 5 stages. And the first stage is the traditional society. In the traditional society, it is characterized by subsistence agriculture, and the production is mainly for survival. And there won't be a lot of surplus production that will result in low productivity. And the social structure is very hierarchical, and it is characterized by a rigid power concentration, where power is only concentrated in the landowners. In chiefdoms, we can take an example of local tribal chiefs, and in monarchical states, we can take on the monarchs. And its values are very strongly emphasized on tradition and customs, being very rigid, and they don't open the door for new ideas to emerge, or they don't allow innovation to get in the country. So this stage represents the pre-modern societies before Industrial Revolution, where output and growth are constrained by the limited knowledge and the lack of technology, the lack of incentives for innovation. And when we go to the second society, the second stage, it is called the precondition for takeoff. And in the precondition for takeoff, there is an emergence of change in oriented leadership, where the leadership starts implementing more incentives for innovation and reforms, or there will be external influences beginning to push modernization, and there will be economic diversification in which agriculture becomes more productive, and there will be surplus production that will be supported by trade and urbanization. The big change in this, I believe, is the cultural shift, where society starts valuing more education and starts being open to entrepreneurial stages. And the third stage will be the takeoff stage, where there will be rapid industrialization, rapid technological innovations. Innovation starts to become more of a habit rather than a challenge. And there will be urbanization, where people start to move from rural areas to cities, and there will be more demand for urbanization and more demand for cities to emerge. And this is a very critical point, where growth becomes a self-sustaining part of the country rather than being dependent on other countries. Therefore, there's the drive to maturity. The main difference and the key differences in this stage will be diversified economy, where innovation becomes routine, as I've mentioned, and there will be a social evolution where greater social mobility emerges, and there will be a large number of middle class in the country. The fifth and the last stage of the last stage will be the age of high consumption, and as we can understand from the name itself, its main features will be consumer society, where people start focusing on goods, and there will be enough surplus production that people stop merely focusing on survival and start going to leisures and having leisures, and the economy starts to shift from more manufacturing to the service sector, where there will be shift to the service sector, manufacturing declines, and the service sector dominates the GDP. And our viewers may be wondering why we are delving in the theoretical aspects of the modernization theory, where we believe that to understand the view of the European or more modern states of African developmental paths, we need to understand the theoretical aspects that come before the modernization theories. And it will also help us to evaluate how we can see the African developmental paths. Are we merely mimicking the modern countries, the modern Western countries, or are we creating our own sense of development? Are we shaping a Pan-African development way? I believe that's why we're using the theories and it.
As you've concretely briefed, this framework offered clarity to begin with as a posed roadmap to growth. However, critics argued that it was profoundly Eurocentric, meaning that it overlooked the impact of colonial disruption, ignored structural inequalities, and framed African cultures as obstacles to growth rather than as alternative civilizational logics. So this gave rise to newly emerging scholars, that of André Gunder Frank, Samir Amin, and Walter Rodney, who reframed underdevelopment not as a natural stage, but as a product of global capitalism. So the key argument here was that African economies were integrated into the global north, into the global system in a subordinate position, exporting raw materials, importing finished goods, and sustaining the prosperity in the global north. So dependency theory offered a critical lens to Africa, that development was no longer just a question of internal deficiency, but of historical exploitation. And André Gunder Frank in the world system theory emphasized this approach as viewing the states as core and peripheries was entirely a system that was laid by the global north, and we were just the metropolitan states that were just being critically looked by the satellite states. So moving on to you, how do you observe the limitations of this theory?
Well, in his theory, in the dependency theory, I believe development was not a question of internet deficiency, and it's more of a historical exploitation. And yet it had also limitations by emphasizing external domination and taking away from the African agency. It takes away and limits the capacity for autonomous reform, the capacity for change, and I believe that's the biggest drawback of this theory.
Thank you, Fraul. I like that you mentioned autonomous reform, because it brings back our focus to our central question of this discussion, which is tradition versus transformation. In contemporary Africa, development is not just about economic growth, it's about cultural self-definition. So across the continent, we see this tension in governance, aesthetics, and urban life. African societies are reinterpreting the term development by itself. They're questioning the term South by itself, and modernity through their own historical and cultural lenses, and blending ancestral values with digital innovation, rethinking leadership through Ubuntu ethics, and reviving indigenous design in global fashion. So, but the underlying question still persists. As we modernize, are we evolving in our own terms, or are we erasing ourselves through imitation? Can Africa actually articulate a development paradigm, such as that of the Asian tigers, which they integrated their own sense of leadership into their political economy? And can we simultaneously grasp this idea of being modern and authentically African?
Well, perhaps the solution lies in a Pan-African approach, one that treats development not as merely a development in GDP and numbers, but a development in self-determination, in supporting our own values, supporting our own tradition, and making them our base for development. A model rooted in Africa's historical experience, cultural logic, and collective vision. I believe the Agenda 2063 and And Africa we want is going towards that path, and it tried to put these pillars in its principles, in its 7 principles. So we are going to see how Agenda 2063's principles represent a Pan-African way of development. So Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, is more than a continental developmental plan. It's a modern articulation of Pan-Africanism in a policy form. So it has put 7 aspirations, and the first aspiration is African unity and self-reliance at the core. So I believe Pan-Africanism has always been emphasized in unity and self-determination. They believe that Africa's destiny must be shaped by Africans themselves. That is the critical point that we should take to stray away from the more westernized standard of modernization, where African-led development rejects dependency on external countries or external factors and external aids mainly, and it prioritizes homegrown policies. And we can see these changes manifesting in the African continental free trade area, where they are trying to integrate Africa into a one continental free trade zone, which is a big step forward to the Kwame Nkrumah's dream of becoming Africa must unite. And I believe that Agenda 2063's first principle really shows Africa's first steps to being a modern country, a modern continent on its own base, rather than being dependent on the Western style or the Western stage, you know. And the second is the cultural resistance and African identity. The third is economic integration and collective prosperity. Agenda 2063 actively seeks to make Africa economically sovereign and stop dependence on the other countries. We can see this in the fourth principle, political independence and good governance. We can see it in the fifth principle, people-centered in development and inclusion. The sixth, sustainable and indigenous developmental models. And the last, in the seventh, a vision rooted in history but focused on the future, meaning our vision is rooted in the history of our exploitation, in the history of, how we mentioned in the Andre Gunder Frank independency theory, we mentioned that the capitalistic state system imposed Africa into becoming a periphery state, a periphery that is dependent on the core. And this vision is, even though it is rooted in history, we're not just going to be like, oh, we're at this stage, we became very underdeveloped because of the Westerns, because of the Europeans. We are not going to stop there. We are going to be rooted in the history, we are going to be remembering them, but we are going to be focused on the future and what we can do to further expand, further change the narrative that the European countries, the Western countries have about Africa. You know, when we say the third world or Africa, the first thing people think of is drought, desertification, so underdeveloped people, poverty. And I believe blaming the West for all of those won't solve any of our problems, because it will be just pointing fingers to the Western countries. Oh, they did this to us, they did this to us, so that's why we are here. This, as I have mentioned before, really takes away the capacity for innovation, the capacity for change. It really takes away the African agency for reforms. And I believe that the 7 principles of the Agenda 2063 really shows that the Agenda 2063 Africa we want is going to the path where we are trying to move away from the past and focus more on a brighter future based on a Pan-Africanism development style, not merely mimicking the Western standard, but creating our own style of development, learning from the Tiger states, as you have mentioned. Development doesn't have to be a loss of identity. We can be developed like the Western countries while keeping our African identity. And I believe the African Union, its Agenda 2063, is going toward that path. Now, is it really going on the ground?
We'll have We'll have to figure that out through our own program, where we dive deeper into how Africa is implementing these principles on the ground.